Hello friends, a very warm welcome to Ansarkari. I am Vikas Bhardwaj and continuing the theme for understanding what has been happening in the world history and how it is shaping the Cold War. We have been taking up very important themes. Our focus is on concepts so that you can apply them by understanding it. Today we are going to pick up the European Community from 1973 to Maastricht Treaty, that is in 1991 and beyond. So let's start with understanding that when European community is coming up into the picture from 1973 onwards, what is happening till 1971? Because the main developments and the problems after the six became nine in 1973, that means six nations became nine nations. That's how we have to see. And I will also allow you to think which were the six nations and how they became nine by following the understanding that US being a superpower, USSR being a superpower, and how Europe is surviving at that time. So let's see the Lome Convention of 1975. It was from the beginning that European community was criticized for being too inward looking and self-centered and for apparently showing no interest in using any of the wealth to help the world's poorer nations. This agreement worked out in Lome, the capital of Togo in West Africa, and it did something to offset the criticism that they will do something because they are the master colonizers of the past. But everybody said that they are doing too little and too late. It allowed goods produced in over 40 countries in Africa and in Caribbeans, mostly former European colonies. They will be bringing back stuff to the European nations that is also free of duties in European Economic Community. It also promised economic aid. The third world poor countries, they were added to the list later because Europe, like US and also all Western powers, they were always resistant. Like today, they are also resistant for any global peace treaty, global climate change, and also other global problems, including plastic and also wildlife. Direct elections to the European Parliament took place from 1979 onwards because it has been in existence by over 20 years. But the election, you can say, the European Parliament, the idea and the aspect was far away from the ordinary people. That is why the reason to introduce elections was to try to arouse more interest and bring ordinary people into closer contact with the affairs of the European community. The first election took place in June 1975 and they were supposed to be taking place every 5 years. And by the time next election came along, 1984, the Greece had also joined the community like Belgium. Greece also became a member and it was a change because in these three countries, what we can say is apart from Belgium and Greece, it was more or less like a compulsory voting. The highest turnout in a country where voting was voluntary was 57%, that is in the West Germany. So what we are trying to see is that there was a change, there was a process. Was the same process in ASEAN? No. Was the same process in SARC? No. That's what we have to see and we can understand the future developments. There was introduction of exchange rate mechanism in 1979. This was introduced to link the currencies of member states in order to limit the extent to which individual currencies like Italian lira, French, Luxembourg, Belgian francs, and also German mark, they could change in value against the currencies of other members. So a strong economy usually have a strong currency. It was hoped that linking currencies would help control inflation and eventually lead to a single currency for the whole European community. Initially, British decided not to take the pound sterling into ERM, but it made a mistake of joining in October 1990 when the exchange rate was relatively high. Now we know Britain has already existed from European Union. So European Economic Community, the original members as we are seeing ECSC by 1952 and then EEC it is becoming by 1957 and there are members who are joining in 1973 including United Kingdom and Ireland and then there are members who are joining in 1981 including East Germany and East Germany is obviously Germany unification is taking place later on by 1990 and then you can say Portugal and Spain also are joining by 1986. So this is a very important development to be seen that even if European Union is coming up in the picture, was it really helping the whole world? Was it really solving the problem of Cold War? Was it really acting as a proxy for US and so forth? So community membership was growing, as I already told you that in 1981 Greece joined, and after that Portugal and Spain also followed by 1986, and that's how the membership became 12, and the community population became over more than 320 million. These countries were not allowed to join early on because their political systems were undemocratic in the eyes of the US, UK, and you can say the Western powers. So there was an increasing pressure from these countries for more action to help the less developed states and to improve the economic balance between the rich and poor nations. And that is how the strategy had been civilizing the worst. But actually, how did they came into that situation? That is what one has to think. Even for countries like India, India was a world power when the British came to us. They exploited and they went back. Membership increased again in 1995 when Austria, Finland, Sweden and three relatively wealthy states they joined the community. During the early years of the membership, many British people were disappointed that British did not seem to be gaining any obvious benefit from this setup. The Irish Republic, which joined at the same time, immediately enjoyed a surge of prosperity as their exports, mainly agriculture produce, found new markets in the community, but same was not true for the Britain. Encouraging developments occurred in 1986 when all 12 members working closely negotiated some important changes, and it was hoped that now the system would work very well. And a move to completely free and common market, no restrictions of any kind on internal trade and movement of goods by 1992 was sought at the time when India was starting liberalization. More European community control over health, safety protocol, protection of environment and protection for consumers was sought. More encouragement to scientific research and technology, more help for backward regions and introduction of majority that is voting on issues with the Council of Ministers. This would prevent measure from being vetoed by just one state which felt that its national interest might be threatening or might be threatened by that measure. So this is the whole system which is coming up. More powers for European Parliament so that it could take measures and less delay is there and more value is there for whatever it is doing. The domestic parliaments of the member states were gradually losing some control over their internal affairs. That is why European Parliament was coming into picture. Common Agriculture Policy, CAP, one of the controversial aspects of this development, and this was actually controversial because farmers were believed to be beneficial of this process, but actually when the farmers were encouraged to stay in business, but it was becoming very costly for them. That is why subsidies were paid to them, that is extra cash to top up their profits. This would ensure them worthwhile profits at the same time, and this would keep the prices at reasonable level for consumers. But one can think of that why it was supposed to be done, how long the subsidy would be given, and it was unethical and incomparable with respect to the developing countries including India, but nobody was going to ask them. So policy continued, and by 1980 3/4 of the entire budget was being paid each year in subsidies to farmers. Britain, Netherlands, West Germany, they pressed for a limit to be placed on subsidies, but the French government was reluctant to agree because it did not want to upset French farmers who were doing very well out of the subsidies. So now India also is having a kind of free trade agreement with UK, which is not part of European Union, and European Union is also going to have a bilateral trade agreement with India, and we have to see that how it works. So greater integration took place by Maastricht Treaty 1991. A summit meeting of all heads of the member states was held in Maastricht, Netherlands in December 1991, and an agreement was drawn up, a new stage in process of creating an even closer union among the people of Europe. Some points that were agreed upon: more powers to European Parliament, greater economic and monetary union, culmination into taking up a common currency, that is euro, was shared by all members by the end of the century, that is beginning of the 21st century, a common foreign and security policy, a timetable drawn up strategy that would be achieved. These all developments were to be seen in the light that it was believed that this community and this union is going to work for not only their own betterment but for the rest of the world also. But we have to understand here, British objected very strongly to the idea of a federal Europe and monetary union and to a whole section of treaty known as social chapter, by which a set of regulations designed to protect people at work. These rules were about, for example, safety and health, working conditions, equality at work between men and women, consulting workers, keeping them informed about what's going on, and protection of workers, which like this was made an idea that the whole thing will be known to them. That is why Maastricht Treaty, which was signed by several Western European countries, very important for the prelims. All this and all these names you must remember, and their locations also at the same time. Please do have a look, create your own chart, and move on. In the end, because of the British objections, the social chapter was removed from the treaty and was left to individual government to decide whether or not to carry out. So the rest of the Maastricht Treaty without social chapter was ratified by the national parliament of the 12 members, and it has been achieved by October 1993. The French, the Dutch, the Belgian government supported the treaty strongly because they thought it was the best way to make sure that the power of unified Germany was contained and controlled within the community. The people of Denmark first voted against it, and it took determined campaigning by the government before it was approved by a narrow majority in the second referendum. Swiss people voted not to join the community. So did Norwegians. Even the French referendum, the majority was in favor of, majority people who were in favor of Maastricht Treaty was tiny. In Britain, the government would not allow a referendum, and the conservative was split over Europe, and the treaty was approved only by a narrowest majority in parliament. Now we know what was going at the back. So by the mid 1990s, almost 40 years of existence, European Community, also known as European Union by 1992, had been a great success economically and had fostered good relations with the member states. But there were vital issues. How much closer economic and political cooperation could become? collapse of communism in the states of Eastern Europe. Now there are more members of European Union after that point. And would these states would join European Union? If so, what should be the attitude of the existing members? Poland and Hungary formally applied for membership in April 1994. So this is how it is. Like we can know that originally there were 6 members, and then some members joined in 1973, 1981, 1986, 1995, and some members joined in even 2004. So we have to understand the whole chronology. You can just Google it and just identify, and also make sure that non-members like Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, they have applied membership in 2007, and later on further development took place. What's the difference between Europe and European Union? We have to see, and this is the question I'm leaving out for you. This is very important for the prelims, that you must know that all members of Europe are not, or definitely part of European Union. And within every couple of years there are questions coming up that like what actually, who are actually the members, and other kind of community developments. But the New World Order, which we discuss separately, and the war against global terrorism, this is very, very important to be seen as separate and very important topic, because communism collapsed in Eastern Europe and USSR broke up in 1991. The Cold War came to an end on paper officially. USA was left as the world's only superpower, and following its victory over communism, USA was full of confidence and pride in the superiority of the way of its life and its institutions. This is very true. Now China is coming up. Optimists thought that the world could now look forward to a period of peace and harmony, because now only the US is there. USA, which itself saw as a land of freedom, benevolence, would lead the rest of the world forward, and whenever necessary, it will work for democracy, prosperity, and USA will act as the world's policeman. Though it is acting as a policeman, but it is acting as a wild and also incoherent policeman. So raw states are not under control now. In fact, US has also become one of that those kind of states in some ways. The new order turned to be quite different, because much of the rest of the world did not wish to be led any more by the USA, and disagreed with USA's worldview, since it was so powerful both militarily and economically. It was difficult for small countries to challenge USA in a conventional way. That is why, to the extremists, it seemed terrorism was the only way to strike. The USA and its allies and America were full of pride in their country's achievement. In 1997, David Rothkopf, a minister in Clinton administration, wrote the Americans should not deny the fact that all nations in the history of the world, theirs is the most just, most tolerant, and the best model for the future. I want to ask you, do you really agree with this when it was said in 1997? And now we are coming in the first quarter of the 21st century. So we will discuss that. Terrorism was nothing new. Anarchists were responsible for many assassinations around the turn of the 19th century, 20th century. We have discussed in our series also. During 19th and late 20th century, there were many terrorist organizations, but terrorism is supposed to be seen from the perspective of who you are talking. There may be a revolutionary. Even British considered Bhagat Singh and other revolutionaries as terrorists, but they were not terrorists for us. Similarly is the case with Mazzini and other leaders. So, but we have to see in the modern times it is differently. Osama bin Laden and even Al Qaeda, they cannot be supported under any means. So terrorist organizations were localized, carrying out their campaign in the known area. That was in the beginning. ETA wanted Basque state completely independent of Spain, very important for the prelims. And similarly, IRA, you have to study it separately also, wanted Northern Ireland united with the Irish Republic. This is also a long drawn process. In 1970s, terrorists began to act outside their own territories. For example, in 1972, Arab terrorists killed 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics, and there was a series of bomb explosions on aircraft. In 1980s, it became clear that the USA was the chief target. There was an attack at the American embassy in Beirut, that is Lebanon, 1983. American airliner flying from Frankfurt to New York crashed into Scottish town of Lockerbie after a bomb exploded on board. A bomb exploded in the World Trade Center in New York in February 1993. US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were attacked in 1998. And there was an attack on American battleship Cole in Port Aden in the Yemen in 2000. There are more examples also. So what were these actions? Those actions of USA which caused the desperation among other people, that is what we have to see. Clearly there was a complex combination of actions and policies which led to such extreme actions. UN foreign policy continued on the same extremist course during the Cold War. December 89, at least 2,000 civilians were killed when US forces invaded and bombed Panama. Very sad. This was an operation designed to arrest Manuel Noriega, the Panamanian military leader who was the power behind President of Panama during 1980s. During 1990s, American helped suppress left-wing movements in Mexico, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru. In 1999, they took part in controversial bombing of Serbia, as we have discussed in our previous lecture. Twice in 1989 and 2001, American agents intervened in Nicaraguan elections, and the first time to defeat the left-wing government, and second time to prevent left to come into the power. So US had been doing all these things for a long, long time. US failed to intervene in such situations where international opinion hoped for a decisive US role. In Rwanda, genocide is taking place in 1994, and US was reluctant to play a full part, since no direct US interests were involved, and intervention on a sufficiently large scale could not be expressed, because it was supposed to be very expensive for the US and they were not going to benefit. Because the delays, 500,000 people were massacred. The USA often failed to support the United Nations. In 1984, President Reagan talked about the importance of international law and order without law. He said there can only be chaos and disorder, and that's what USA is doing precisely in many ways. So the previous day he had rejected the verdict of International Court of Justice, which condemned USA for its unlawful use of forces in mining the harbors in Nicaragua. And same thing we can think about Pakistan also, what US had done. Same thing we think about Afghanistan in so many ways. So there are complex applied ideas. I'm just trying to tell you the concept first. US had a long history of vetoing UN Security Council resolutions, opposing General Assembly resolutions. In 1985, USA was the only country to vote against resolution proposing new policies for improving the safeguarding of human rights. In 1996, at the World Food Summit organized by the UN, the USA refused to endorse a general view that it was everyone's right to have a safe and nutritious food. It is still not part of WHO today, and also it is getting out of UNESCO. President George W. Bush was less than enthusiastic about some of the agreements entered into by the previous administration. That happens with every US president if he is from Democrat or he is from Republican Party. So during the first year in office and before 11 September, he rejected 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty, withdrew from the 1997 Kyoto Protocols on climate change, and halted the new diplomatic contacts with North Korea and refused to cooperate in discussions about control of chemical weapons. But such is the powerful nature of US economy that decision taken in Washington and New York had a worldwide repercussions like we can think about today's in Donald World times. With the increased globalization of the world's economy, American companies had interest all over the world. So the rise of global terrorism, when we think about how we can define terrorism, which is the method of political action that uses violence or deliberately produces fear against civilians and against civilian infrastructure in order to influence behavior and to inflict punishment to exact revenge. These are one of the basic definitions. For the perpetrator, the point is to make target group afraid of today, afraid of tomorrow, and afraid of each other. It is an act and also an ideology in some ways. Its instrument are assassination, mass murder, hijacking, bombing, kidnapping, intimidation, and such acts cannot be committed by states as well as private groups. Can be attacked, I should say, can be committed by states as well as private groups, non-state actors. Let's see some of the terrorist groups. Abu Nidal organization was one of the earliest groups that made itself felt, formed in 1974 to be more precise again. It was an offshoot of Yasser Arafat's Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, very important, which was thought not to be sufficiently aggressive. The ANO was committed to a completely independent Palestinian state. It had bases in Lebanon and Palestine and some of the refugee camps and drew support from Syria, Sudan, and at first from Libya. It was responsible for operations in about 20 countries, including attacks on airports in Rome and Vienna and number of aircraft hijackings. Since early 1990s, ANO has been less active. Obviously, new forms came up. Hezbollah, the Party of God, also known as Islamic Jihad, was formed in Lebanon 1982 after the Israeli invasion of mainly Shia Muslims. They claim to be inspired by Ayatollah Khamenei, the ruler of Iran. Hamas, Islamic Resistance Movement, formed in 1987 with the aim of setting up an independent Islamic State of Palestine. It tried to combine armed resistance to Israel with political activity by running candidates for some Palestinian Authority elections. Hamas has a massive support in West Bank and Gaza Strip. In the last few years, it has specialized in suicide bomb attacks against Israeli targets, and we have read also in the current newspapers. Hamas was formed in 1987, that's what we are saying. But then we have to see whether it is Hamas, whether it is Al Qaeda, whether it is Tehreek-e-Insaf, whether it is other bodies which are operating in Central Asia and also parts of Pakistan and Afghanistan border. But what about the proxy terrorism which has been sponsored by the by the Pakistan, and it has already been supported by the US also and by China. September 2001 and the war on terror is a very important understanding because September attacks in 2001, four airliners on internal flights in the USA were hijacked. The first one was deliberately crashed into the 110th story of North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York. In the meantime, a third plane was flown into Pentagon, a building near Washington that housed the US Department of Defense, and the fourth plane missed its intended target and crashed in a rural area of Pennsylvania, not far from Pittsburgh. It was the most stunning atrocity ever experienced in US, or you can say on US soil. Although no organization claimed responsibility for the attacks, US government assumed Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were guilty. Certainly, it must have been carried out by educated professionals with considerable financial backing, like the members of Al-Qaeda who were known to number perhaps 5,000 highly trained activists. Recovering quickly from the initial shock, President Bush announced USA would hunt down and punish not only the perpetrators, what he called these acts of war, but also those who supported and harbored them. The outrages were condemned by most world government, although there was reports of Palestinians and other Muslim groups celebrating at the humiliation of the USA. President Saddam Hussein of the Iraq was reported to be as saying that the USA was reaping the thorns of its foreign policy. Bush and the war against terrorism is in the background of understanding that the American government immediately tried to build on worldwide sympathy, and in order to create a coalition to fight against terrorism, NATO condemned the outrages and stated that attack on one member of state should be treated as an attack on all 19 members. Each country would be required to assist if necessary within a short time. Coalition of states were put together to enable terrorist assets to be frozen and collect wide-ranging intelligence, and some of the countries promised to help with military action against terrorists and against the Taliban government of Afghanistan, which was accused of sheltering Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Some of the Bush statements during the period were disturbing to other governments. For example, he stated the countries were either with us or against us, implying that the right to remain neutral did not exist. Now we have to think in this context what happened to India. India was always suffering from terrorism from Pakistan. But did the US, did the UN, did the Europe help? No. He also spoke about an axis of evil in the world which would have been dealt with. Evil states were Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. What about Pakistan? What about those countries which are actually perpetrating terrorism for a long time, like Pakistan? What about China, which is supporting Pakistan? This opened up possibility of long series of military operations with USA playing the part of world policeman or the playground bully. That is what we have to understand without UN sanctions. If US singled out Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda as its targets, it would run up against the widely held view that terrorist attacks in and of themselves did not justify military responses against the sovereign states. But then it did it also. USA widened its claim of self-defense to include Taliban, government of Afghanistan, which was accused of supporting terrorist acts. UN Security Council passed two resolutions which did not authorize military action under the UN Charter, but allowed it the right of self-defense in customary international law. USA issued an ultimatum to Taliban demanding that they hand over Bin Laden and they hand over also other colleagues who are directly involved. When this was rejected by Taliban, the scene was set for use of force. So Mullah Zaif, one of the Taliban leaders, issued a press strongly condemning the attacks and calling for those responsible to be brought to justice. No doubt he knew what to expect when he added, "We want America to be patient and careful in their actions." So that is how the background to attack on Afghanistan would include the history of previous 30 years in Afghanistan, extremely violent and confused situation. In 1978, a left-wing government seized power and began modernizing program with the support of USSR. In a country where Islamic authority was strong, changes such as the equal status for men and women, secularization of society was seen as an affront to Islam. Fierce opposition was there. Civil war started. Soviet troop entered in 1979 to support the government. They were afraid if the regime was overthrown by a fundamentalist Muslim revolution like the one in Iran in July 1979, January 1979, it would stir up millions of Muslims who were Soviet citizens and destabilize those republics and with substantial Muslim populations. So USSR expected shorter campaign, but the US government treated it as a part of the Cold War, sent extensive aid to Muslim opposition in Afghanistan. There were several rival Muslim groups, but they all worked together, collectively known as Mujahideen, to drive out Russians. By 1986, Mujahideen, this means those who are waging jihad, were receiving a large amount of weaponry via Pakistan from USA and China. Most important thing. And they were also getting ground-to-air missiles which had a devastating effect on Afghan and Soviet air bases. One of the organizations fighting with the Mujahideen was Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, who was ironically receiving training and weapons from the USA with the help of CIA. Now, this is the same Osama bin Laden about which we are talking, that attack will be there on US. Mujahideen formed a coalition government, but the country soon fell into total chaos. Rival factions fought for power. During 1919, the faction known as Taliban, meaning students, gradually took control of the country. Today also they are ruling. Driving out rival groups by the area, Taliban were a conservative Muslim faction made up of Pashtuns, ethnic group in the southeast part of the country, especially in the province of Kandahar. By end of 2000, they controlled most of the country except northwest, where they were opposed by the rival ethnic groups Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Hazara, known as Northern Alliance. And we have to understand, and sometime we will discuss separately, that how India was supporting the Hazaras because it is more true representative. Taliban regime aroused international disapproval. Today also, women were mostly excluded from public life, prevented from continuing teachers and students, and also as doctors in other professions. Harsh criminal punishments were introduced. Women were often publicly beaten for showing their ankles. Mass execution took place in public in Ghazi football stadiums. Its cultural policies seem unreasonable. For example, music was banned. Cultural experts regarded them as unique treasures, but Taliban blew them up, claiming that they were offensive to Islam. Government allowed country to be used as refuge and training ground for Islamic militants. Osama bin Laden, because of combination of ravages of years of civil war and 3 consecutive years of drought, economy was in ruins. There were severe food shortages as refugees and those who could no longer sustain on the land flocked into cities. Yet when the UN tried to distribute food supplies in Kabul, government closed their offices. They objected to foreign influence. Even today, if you see in 2025, then Taliban is not recognized by India and China had recognized it, but rest of the world is not recognizing it and situation is not much better. A joint US-UK operations against Afghanistan in 2001, to be precise, 7 October, it went on to start a kind of a long-term operation. Taliban targets and Al-Qaeda camps were attacked. Cruise missiles fired from ships. American long-range bombers carried out raids on the center of Kabul. Troops of Northern Alliance began offensive against Taliban positions in northwest. On October 14th, Taliban offered to hand Bin Laden over to an intermediary state, not directly to the USA. They demanded that USA stop the bombing. President Bush rejected the offer, refused to negotiate. Taliban forces put up strong resistance, and at the end of the month, they still control most of the country. During the November 2001, under pressure from the continued US attacks and Northern Alliance forces, the Taliban began to lose their grip. On 12th November, they abandoned Kabul and soon driven out from their main power base, that is the province of Kandahar. They fled into mountains, border into Pakistan. USA continued to bomb the mountain region, hoping to flush out Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda fighters, but without success. That is what you have to understand. So NATO troops who were trying to keep peace and help build the economy, but it was an uphill task. Most ominous development was the Taliban that had regrouped in the south over borders in Pakistan, financed partially by the rising heroin and opium production. UN officials were worried that Afghanistan might once again turn into a raw state in the hands of drug cartels. So violence continued. Even the aid agencies come under attack in the summer of 2004. Medicine Sans Frontier (PT) questions have already been come of that, which had it's an NGO of international doctors which had been active in Afghanistan for a quarter of century, decided to pull out. Serious blow to ordinary Afghans. India also in supporting humanitarian aid till now. Nevertheless, the promised elections took place in November 2004, able to move on, and largely peacefully it happened in spite of threat of violence. Taliban president from the Taliban, the president Karzai, Ahmad Karzai, was elected for a 5-year term. He won 55.4% votes, which was not much as he had hoped, but enough for him to claim that now legitimacy and mandate is there from the people. And now we to know today that even Ahmad Karzai was also supposed to run away from Afghanistan and with the help of US support, and we don't know where he is as of now, but not in Afghanistan where Taliban rules. So the downfall of Saddam Hussein is a separate topic which we had to see, because after his defeat in the first Gulf War in 1991, Saddam Hussein was allowed to remain in power. He defeated uprising of Kurds in the north and Shia Muslims in the south, where he was especially brutal in his treatment of rebels, and that was somehow ideologically and also strategically good for the US. When refugees fled into marshes, Saddam had the marshland drained and many thousands of Shia were killed. He had already used chemical weapons in his war against Iran and against the Kurds, and was known to have biological weapons program. By 1995, Iraq had well advanced nuclear weapons program, and they were reluctant to remove Saddam Hussein because of the chaos that might follow. The USA, UK, they tried to restrain him like the Iran by continuing to trade embargo placed on Iraq by the UN soon after Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait. That is how the development was taking place. So in 2000, these sanctions had been placed for 10 years, but they seemed to have little impact on Saddam. It was the ordinary people of Iraq who were suffering because of the shortages of food and medical supplies. In September 1998, UN relief program in Iraq, the chief, the director, one can say, Dennis Halliday, resigned, saying that he could no longer carry out such an immoral and illegal policy. In 1999, UNICEF reported that since 1990, over a half million children had died from malnutrition and lack of medicine, and direct result of sanctions. These sanctions did ensure that Saddam allowed inspections of his nuclear sites by the member of IAEA, organized by the UN Security Council resolution. It was discovered that Iraqis had all the components necessary to manufacture nuclear warheads, and the construction was actually underway. In 1998, the IAEA team destroyed all Saddam nuclear sites and took away the equipment. At this point, however, there was no talk of removing Saddam from power, since he was keeping the Kurds and Shias under control, thereby preventing destabilization of the region. So US and UK, they started prepared to attack. The warning signal came with the President Bush State of the Union address in 2002, where he referred to the world's raw states, which was threat because of their weapons of mass destruction. That is the word he used, and he called them axis of evil. The states named Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. Iran is still there, in the same way, like we can see. It soon became clear the USA, encouraged by its relatively easy victory in Afghanistan, as we have discussed, it was about to turn attentions to Iraq. But in Afghanistan also, we will discuss separately again that it was not a victory. The US media began to try to convince the rest of the world that Saddam Hussein presented serious threat, and the only remedy was regime change. The justification put forward by the Americans for an attack on Iran were Saddam had chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons and was working on a program to produce ballistic missiles which could fly more than 200 kilometers, thus breaking the 150-kilometer limit, and these missiles were necessary for the delivery of WMD. The entire world situation changed since September 11 that is 9/11 that we call, and the war against terrorism required that states which supported and encouraged terrorism should be restrained. Iraq was harboring terrorist groups, including members of Al Qaeda, which had training camps specialized in chemical and explosives. Iraqi intelligence services were also cooperating with Al Qaeda together, and they presented a formidable threat to USA and its allies. So the longer action was delayed, the greater danger would be. That is what US was wondering. Khader Hamza, an Iraqi exile who had worked on his country's nuclear program, told the USA in August 2002 that Saddam would have a usable power weapons by 2005, and some supporters of the war compared the situation with the 1930s when appeasers failed to stand up to Hitler and allowed him to become too powerful. So this is one of the comparisons. That what you can say is that this is a cycle which had continued throughout the 20th century by the powerful nations, but they have not worked much for the humanity. There must be a good governance system at the international level. So opposition to the war is there. UK Prime Minister Tony Blair pledged support to the US attack on Iraq. There was much less enthusiasm in the rest of the world. There had been campaign against Taliban in Afghanistan. Uh, because it was believed that Taliban, as far as campaign against Taliban, is far more legitimate and far more rational, but not against the Iraq. There were massive anti-war demonstrations in UK, Australia, and many other countries, even in USA itself. Given that all nuclear facilities had been destroyed and even more stringent trade sanctions had been imposed, it was highly unlikely that Saddam Hussein had been able to rebuild these facilities for producing WMD. Since 1998, Iraq had been fundamentally disarmed. 1995, 90 to 95% of Iraq's weapons of WMD have been verifiably eliminated. This included all of the factories to produce chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, long-range ballistic missiles, associated equipment, these factories, and the vast majority of product coming out of these factories. Clearly, Iraq was much less threat in 2002 than it had been in 1991. That is what we have to understand. So there was insufficient evidence. Insufficient evidence. The Iraq was harboring Al Qaeda terrorists. U.S. military intervention would make situation worse by fostering even more violent anti-Western feeling. That was what was believed. Congressional reports published in 2004 concluded that the critics of the war had been right. Saddam had no stocks of weapons of WMD, and there was no links between Saddam, Al Qaeda, and 9/11. It was suggested the real motive of the USA was nothing to do with the war against terrorism. It was simply the case of world's only superpower blatantly extending its control more widely to maintaining US global preeminence and also oil plus war machinery going on. So the continuing war in Afghanistan, if we see the President Karzai, who was elected in 2004 for a 5-year term, his task was difficult. His new slogan, national participation, aimed at building government for moderates. He immediately launched campaign to sideline the warlords and to clean up drug trafficking and persuade farmers to switch to other crops instead of growing opium poppies. Taliban insurgency, it gathered pace. So did the return to opium as a main cash crop. I would say India is also supporting Ahmed Karzai parliament, dams, and also Chahbar port, which is coming up in Iran, was also part of the same strategy. By 2007, half of the country's GDP came from illegal drugs. Attempt by NATO forces to control crop only led to further violence. It was clear that to many observers that it was highly unlikely that Taliban could be defeated militarily. Karzai himself admitted that he tried without success to open negotiations with Taliban. His first message to newly elected President Obama was the heartfelt plea to stop the bombing of civilians. This was soon after civilian troops had bombed a wedding party in Kandahar, allegedly killing 40 people. But the US had no answer to these things. Some NATO members were beginning to think about reducing their troops numbers in the coalition force. Like Vietnam, for US it is very difficult to handle Afghanistan, and we know finally Afghanistan was left on its own and US ran away. So let's see some of the questions which are actually pondering on different topics, not exactly what we have discussed. Examining the changing nature of security in the post-Cold War international relations, assess the impact of globalization on sovereignty of national states in the post-Cold War world, assess India's policy in response to terror post-2001, really very important for us, concept of strategic autonomy in Indian foreign policy in the 21st century, relevance of nuclear deterrence theory, is the world moving towards multipolarity, discuss with examples from post-World War developments, evaluate the idea of multipolarity in the contemporary world, with reference to India's foreign policy, examine the role of India in shaping regionalism and trans-regionalism in global south. India's foreign policy is driven by both interests and values discussed in global governance perspective, discuss the impact of post-Cold War US foreign policy on global politics. I have taken up these questions not from the perspective that we have discussed them. I just want you to think about them, just want to make short notes and we can discuss them separately, thereby making sure that all different elements including static and applied part is in your pocket when it comes to the main examination, thereby ensuring your success with Ansarkari and its amazing and path breaking programs. Thank you very much.